Matt, you taught us about the Shemitah year, pulling out 3 reasons for this mitzvah, the mitzvah of every 7 years allowing the land to rest. First, to give us free time. Second, to address hunger and poverty. And third, to give us a more sustainable relationship with the earth. If people are working all the time, you taught us, they wouldn't have time to make important discoveries or to enjoy themselves. You make the case that free time is important in and of itself. You bring Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer's teaching that freedom for work gives us the opportunity to grow in wisdom. And then you point out that in the Shemitah system, poor people were the first to be able to eat, making it an important balancing system for economic inequality. And finally, you tell us that the Shemitah system reminds us that the earth doesn't only exist to serve us, giving us an opportunity to imagine a different way to live on the earth than one based on extraction and maximization of harvest, production, profit. And Abe, you talked about the idea that house robbery during the day versus during the night are different in the Torah, pointing out that tradition tells us that we have the right to kill at night in self-defense because you can't see clearly. And you can't tell if a person's coming to kill you. It was smart to make the connection to stand your ground laws today, which are also about a snap judgment about whether a person is in mortal danger. What's problematic is not just the honor system, as you taught us, but also the fact that our judgments about danger are based on our assumptions about other people and even our imagination. You brought up the case of Kyle Rittenhouse. I couldn't help but think when I was reading your Torah and then hearing it today about Trayvon Martin. A boy in a hoodie with a pack of Skittles looked dangerous to George Zimmerman because he was black. And a jury understood why, because they shared that bias, acquitting Zimmerman of murder and even manslaughter. Like the homeowner facing a home intruder in the night, these laws are based on a subjective assessment of danger based on what we see and what we don't see in another person, whether that's because of lack of light at night or whether that's because of bias. This same Parsha is, a few verses later, aware of human bias. In the chapter after the one that you taught from, Abe, there is a teaching about fairness, and it takes into account the idea that human beings are biased. It tells us that we shouldn't, in a dispute, take the side of the mighty because they're mighty, or the poor because they're poor. Neither the powerful nor the powerless. Recognizing that actually there are temptations to be biased in both directions. If we have someone we consider an enemy, the Torah teaches in that same section, someone we're totally biased against, we still have to actually help them if they lose their animal or if their animal's struggling under a heavy burden, even if we think of them as our enemy. The Torah is also in the same section concerned about bribes and the way that bribes, quote, have the potential to, quote, blind the eyes and overturn the words of the just. Again, how we see other people has the potential to subvert justice. And all of these laws at the beginning of chapter 23 in this parsha assume that humans will be biased and try to directly address and correct that bias. The section ends with the second iteration of the most common mitzvah in all of Torah, one that appears 36 times. You shall not oppress the stranger, for you know the soul of the stranger. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So Matt and Abe, here's the question. What connects laws concerning the Shemitah year, allowing the earth to rest every 7 years, and those concerning self-defense in response to a burglary? Our tradition actually gives us 2 ways of seeing the connection between these 2 laws. The first is Yetzer Ra. The Yetzer Ra is translated usually as the evil inclination. It's a part of us, all of us. It's that impulse in us to look out for ourselves, to defend ourselves, to attack enemies or those who might do us harm, to build things for ourselves, to acquire property and wealth, to extract sustenance and profit from the earth, to get and take and build and defend and attack. Now the rabbis are quick to point out that no one would survive without the Yetzer Ra. We actually need it. We need houses to live in. We need food to eat. We need to be safe. But it becomes ra, evil, when it's out of balance. When it's too much, it becomes greed. It becomes violence and war. It becomes oppression and domination. It becomes hate. It becomes murder. And in the very worst cases, it becomes genocide. Thursday was International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the day when Auschwitz was liberated in 1945. Here we are observing this day at a time when the denial of the Holocaust is more widespread than ever before. People actually spread the idea that the Holocaust didn't happen, that we made it up, believe it or not. And 6 million Jews and many others just disappeared from the earth. Meanwhile, just 1 year ago this month, a mob attacked the Capitol with at least one person wearing a shirt that said 6MWE. 6 million wasn't enough. Earlier this year, a Tennessee school board banned the book Mouse, a renowned graphic novel about the Holocaust. And just 2 weeks ago, a man held hostages for 11 hours in a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas. And then just yesterday, the entrance to Union Station, the Washington, D.C. train station across from the Capitol, where all the senators and representatives from the Eastern Seaboard come and go from their work on Capitol Hill, was covered in swastikas. So we know about the Yetzer Ra. We know about what happens when it gets out of control. Whether that's about extracting from the earth in such an exaggerated way that it destroys the planet, or whether that's about acting out of a distorted idea of self-defense combined with bias that makes innocent people into the enemy and justifies their murder. But I mentioned that I found two ways in Jewish tradition to make the connection between the Shemitah year and the laws regarding burglary and self-defense. The second, in addition to the Yetzer Ra, comes from Kabbalah. And it's the idea of mochin de katnut and mochin de gadlut, small mind and big mind. The Kabbalists are talking about two kinds of consciousness. One where the world seems narrow and we have to fight to survive. We have to fight to make sure we have enough, and it's me against you, and it's us against them, and I always need more. We now know that this is literally small mind. It's what we call the reptilian brain. It's the small part of the brain, the oldest part of the brain, nearest the brainstem. But the Kabbalists taught, and perhaps you've experienced, that we can pop out of small mind, out of mochin de katnut, into big mind, mochin de gadlut. Or another way to say it would be expanded consciousness. We can elevate our perspective such that we see the interconnectedness of all humanity and all life. It's like zooming out to see the whole earth and our place in it. It's like what I talked about at the beginning of services, how small we are in relation to the great oneness, in relationship to the limitlessness, in relationship to the whole. This is the consciousness that reminds us 36 times that we know the heart of the stranger, that we know the soul of the stranger, for we were strangers. This is the consciousness that allows us to pause before deciding that someone else is dangerous just because they're different. This is the consciousness that enables us to see ourselves as part of the living system of the earth, to recognize that enough for me is only possible long-term when there's also enough to go around, just exactly as you taught us. That we are part of a great interdependent oneness. We think that survival is small mind. It's actually called the survival brain. But ironically, survival at this point in the evolutionary calendar can only happen with big mind. And that brings us back to the Shemitah year and to Shabbat. Because as you taught us, Matt, we need time. We need time to be free from labor, time to grow in wisdom, to be able to see with mochin de gadlut, with the big mind that we all possess. That is why Shemitah is so important. Sabbaticals are so important. Vacations are so important. That is why Shabbat is so important. important. Time is a prerequisite for the expansion of consciousness we need for our future. The expansion of consciousness we need to have a future. We have it in us not to kill the burglar in the night. We have it in us for never again to be real. We have it in us to live in harmony with the earth. This day, the day of rest, this year, 5782 is a Shemitah year, this year, the year of rest. Big mind is how we can see our way there. Shabbat shalom.